Good morning, kids. This is Dr. Freedom. Today's subject will be the Sphinx. Now, the Sphinx has to be the most intriguing, mysterious, and enigmatic statue to stand on the planet Earth, to this very day. But what's really crazy about it is what Egyptologists will tell you that they know for a fact about this incredible artifact that, just when you look at it, kind of almost looks back at you with a chuckle like, I know something you don't know. And by the time I'm done, I think you'll agree with me that, and I've covered this in another vid I did a long time ago called Egyptologists Are Idiots. You're going to agree with me that a whole lot of people with the letters PhD behind their name, the PhD should stand for pathetic, hypocrite, dork. Especially when you look at the evidence that they base their analysis of who carved the Sphinx is based off of. And I just can't believe these guys are still holding on tooth and nail to this little story that they've built, because the actual facts of this art, this great and beautiful statue, this enigmatic artifact, are stranger than fiction themselves, especially, when you smack these Egyptologists in the face with actual science. They just look at you and laugh and like, you're stupid or something. But, okay, we'll dive right in. Okay, according to Egyptologists, the hardliners, the traditional ones, the Sphinx was carved by the pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC. The same guy who built the middle pyramid, who he would later be known by the Greeks as Chephren. And I still can't believe some of the things, that... Oh, okay, let me just give you the example. The only evidence they have, and this is what they hold on to as hardcore fact, is chiseled on a small tablet, which is, still stands to this day between the paws of the Sphinx, that was carved around 1200 BC by the pharaoh Thutmose IV, and it is known throughout the world as the Dream Stele. Now keep in mind, that's 1200 BC, which is roughly 13 centuries after the time of Khafre. Now on the Dream Stele, it tells the tale of how a young Thutmose was basically, as a boy he was running around and he took shade underneath the head of the Sphinx, because at that time the Sphinx was still buried up to its neck in sand. And while he was taking this nap, he had a very peculiar dream, and it's detailed on the stele about how the Sphinx awoken, came alive, and spoke to him, and told him, basically, the sands are weighing, me down. I am Horus on the horizon, and I still debate that title, given what I've learned from the teachings of Dr. Stephen Mailer and Dr. Abdel Hakim Al-Uyan. But basically, that's another whole other vid. But the Sphinx tells young Thutmose, if you clear away the sand from my back and relieve the stress upon me, I will make sure you become pharaoh. And sure enough, Thutmose, being a son of the royal family, he was already destined to be pharaoh pretty much anyway, but sure enough, he undertakes this great project, has the Sphinx cleared off, and even has some repairs done. And sure enough, he later became pharaoh. And that's basically what the Dream Stele tells you. Now, according to a lower part on this stele, and even now, this part is already flaked off, so there's no real way of determining it. And even when it was there, the whole part, this thing's already eroded, because it's probably been there. It's been there going on 3,000 years. Was the beginnings of a syllable that said Kaf. And from what I've been told, that first syllable of a word, which came out as Kaf, wasn't even in a cartouche, which would designate the name of a pharaoh. But according to this, they're saying that, okay, because that particular syllable was on this tablet. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me for chuckling. That he was trying to tell us that Khafre was the one who carved the Sphinx. And that is their only, let me stress that, only piece of evidence that ties anything having to do with the Sphinx to Khafre. And what I love is when you got guys like Dr. Zahi Hawass, who still argue to this day, and Dr. Mark Lerner, who claims to be the great authority on the Sphinx, and trust me, we're going to go into him later in this particular vid, because his story is a rather sordid one, and I wouldn't believe him if he told me it was raining, unless I went outside to check for myself. They're claiming that the face on the Sphinx matches a statue of Khafre, which is, there's one of him in diorite, which is currently in a museum abroad, and they're claiming that the faces line up. Well, that's not exactly the case. Because if you watch a video called Mystery of the Sphinx, alright, forgive me if I shuffle my notes a little. Back in the 90s, a detective sergeant named Frank Domingo, who wrote the book, literally wrote the book on facial recognition, a 26-year veteran, of being a policeman and also, a forensic facial study, was called in to take a look at the only known image of Khafre, the statue in diorite, and of course the face of the Sphinx. And when he was finished, he concluded I'm talking, this man was 100% convinced, and this is based off facial recognition, face angles, angle of eyes versus mouth, nose versus chin, whatnot, that the face on the Sphinx is not Khafre's. As a matter of fact, he said, if anything, this face, oh God, that's a real good one, this face, I'm going to have to remember that one for later. The face on the Sphinx was that of an African individual, which falls in, once again, with what Dr. Stephen Mailer and Dr. Abdel Hakim Aoyan discussed. Because according to their theories, the Sphinx, being much older than it is, was actually carved based off one of the very first queens of Egypt, and I'll go into that in detail in another video. Like I said, I hate to mention it, not go into it, but we're going to go into the nitty-gritty here. So, right there, you've got a guy who makes his living studying faces and tells you, no way in hell, that this is the same face as the one on that statue. And people are like, well, it's just a statue, whatnot. Yeah, but you have to remember, the Egyptians were very, very detailed, especially when doing statues of pharaohs. Unless you come to the time of Akhenaten, and once again, that's another period we're going to go into later. So right here, you've got this. But also, we're going to take a look at another piece of evidence that Egyptologists blatantly ignore. Sitting in a hidden corner of the Cairo Museum is another stela that was carved around 1200 BC. And now this stela is most definitely a copy of another document, because basically it's in the Egyptian form for the time around 1200 BC, but it seems to be telling us something from another document. So basically, in your mind, think, okay, Latin original Bible, King James Bible, transcribed to English, whatnot. On this inventory stela, which stands hidden in the Cairo Museum, it tells the story of how basically when Khufu built his temple of Isis, the Sphinx was already there. Now, to give you a reference, Khufu was Khafre's father. Now, wait a minute. You guys have been telling me Khafre, carved this big-ass statue. No. We've got right here a transcribed document, also from 1200 BC, like the Dream Stela, that states the Sphinx was already there, the Sphinx was already old at the time Khafre ruled. Khufu ruled, which is Khafre's father. And of course, Khufu built the Great Pyramid. But Egyptologists dismiss the inventory stela as fiction, because it is, even though it is telling this historical record, well, it's not in the appropriate script, blah, blah, blah. But wait a minute, you've got the Dream Stela, which was also carved in 1200 BC, which only has the syllable Kaf on it, and you're holding this up to the world as undeniable canon hardcore proof that Khafre carved the Sphinx. No, folks, I can tell you without a doubt in my mind, Khafre had nothing to do with the carving of the Great Sphinx. He repaired it, and this was one of a number of repair projects that went on. And it's funny as hell, because they're saying Khafre carved the Sphinx in 2500 BC. Yet they have it in record that around the time of 2200 BC, less than 300 years after Khafre's death, that repairs had to be conducted on the Sphinx. One of them being an entire rear-end restore job where they had to build up 3 feet of the rear end of the rump. So wait a minute, you're telling me Khafre carved this thing in 2500 BC, and within 300 years, 3 feet of the rear end's gone? Because if the Sphinx was made of such cruddy limestone, that 3 feet's gone in 300 years, by the time it got to now, some 4,500 years later, that's over 45 feet of the Sphinx is gone, which means it wouldn't even be standing today. It would be a distant memory, it'd be a sand pile, it would not even exist. Now, one of the guys who first saw something was not quite right with the Sphinx, and something was not quite right with the story the Egyptologists were telling, was a man named Dr. John Anthony West. And this man has been preaching, to these people for decades now, that the story they tell you about the Egyptians and the ancient Egyptians does not fit with the facts. But they do not listen to Dr. John Anthony West, because he's one of them oddballs, My God, he might be telling us the world's not flat, he must be a nut. To give you an example of just how tenacious Dr. John Anthony West is, he took a picture. Alright, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. What Dr. John Anthony West noticed is on the Sphinx enclosure and on the body of the rump, and especially the whole body of the Sphinx itself, were a series of vertical fissures, and it appeared as if the limestone had been beaten down. And you have these deep vertical fissures carving through it, at random intervals. And something just did not sit right with this image. So he did some studying, and he found, and his theory was, wait a minute, this looks like rainwater erosion. But of course, the Egyptologists, the hardliners, laughed. Because, wait a minute, you've got to be kidding me. Because Egypt has been bone dry as it is today since roughly 7,000 to 8,000 BC. So, John Anthony West took a photo of the Sphinx. He covered over the top and bottom, they covered over the head and the bottom parts with masking tape. And he took it to an Oxford geologist who to this day refuses to be identified. And he says, "Can you tell me what type of erosion this is on this limestone?" And the guy looked at him and he goes, "Well, let me see. This is textbook rainwater erosion. As a matter of fact, judging from what it looks like, it's been going on for at least a couple thousand years." And then John Anthony West peels back the masking tape, revealing that this is the Sphinx in Egypt. This guy basically got up, walked out of the room, and said, "I do not want my name associated with this. Don't even bother. I'm done." Okay. So, right here he had confirmation, but nobody's wanting to talk to him. Finally, he found a man named Dr. Robert Schoch. Now, to give you an idea of this man's credentials, Dr. Robert Schoch is a Yale-trained geologist. He has a PhD in geology and geophysics, and this is one of the top brains on the planet in this particular arena. So this is not a quack. This is not a guy he picked up at the local community college. Dr. Robert Schoch went to Egypt with him, took one look. You know, he did a good walk around. He studied it a bit, and he looked right at him and goes, "You've got a case here. This is classic textbook rainwater erosion, and it's been going on for, at the time it was wearing down at least a couple thousand years of rainwater beating down on this object." So, Schoch presented his findings. Okay. This is back in 1991, and I'm going to be reading off a quote here. Schoch redated the famous monument to 7,000 to 5,000 BC, and that's a conservative estimate, based on his assertion that the erosion was due mainly to the effects of water rather than wind and sand, and also based on the seismographic studies around the base of the Sphinx and on the plateau. Of course, Dr. Mark Lerner jumped up and down and said, no, that can't be, because we've got this hardcore evidence that Khafre carved it. Yeah, right, you've got a frickin' one syllable on a frickin' flaking off thing from 13 centuries after Khafre died. Now, I hope you're sitting down. Not one, not five, not a dozen. 275 geologists backed Schoch's findings as legitimate and very well proven. 275. Of course, you got guys out on the plateau like, Zahi Hawass and all that who were jumping up and down. I could practically see his head exploding when he heard this. Because, like I said, this is not a guy from the local community college. This is a guy who's Yale-trained geologist, one of the top ones on the planet, and he's looking at you as, I don't care what your damn tablet says. The geology of the limestone says it's this old. Oh man, I can imagine all the aneurysms and headaches. Oh God, I bet Excedrin stock on the Egypt plateau shot through the roof. In the Egyptologist community, I mean, that week. But like I said, it's just amazing that you've got two pieces of evidence. One of them clearly refers to the Sphinx, clearly refers to the fact that it's older than what they say it is. But of course, since it does not fit, and I'm referring to the inventory stele, it's been relegated off to a corner of the museum, and they designated it as being a fictitious story. Now, this is not the first time this has happened, because I'll be going into this in another vid about the King's List, which exists, where it's Ramses showing his son Seti the First, all the kings that came before him. And this is one big, beautifully carved ornamental wall. And of course, it goes all the way back to the very first pharaoh, which everyone should know this name, the Scorpion King, because that's all they knew about him, was his glyph, his cartouche. Inside it was a large scorpion. I believe they later gave him the name Menes, but I don't think anyone really knows what his name actually was. But he came before Djoser. So you got this King's List, and of course they called it, of course it's factual and all that, but of course it's missing a few names because there were kings who were erased from the list, such as Akhenaten, Hatshepsut, and, Tutankhamun, just to name a few. But what they ignore is the other wall. And I'm hoping I can find a picture of it again, where it talks about the Shemsu Hor. The Shemsu Hor are the followers of Horus. This literally goes all the way back, and basically it continues from before the first pharaoh, all the way back to the very first actual god pharaoh, who was Horus himself, son of Osiris and Isis. And from what I've heard and what I've read, if they actually followed the King's List all the way back through the Shemsu Hor, back to the very beginning, we're talking about Egyptian history going back 36,000 years. But of course they don't do that. You see, they go by the King's List going back to the first pharaoh, and of course the other wall is fictitious because it does not fit. And you'll notice this happen a lot in Egypt, Egyptology as well as mainstream archaeology. If it doesn't fit with the facts, they simply ignore it because it can't be true. Our, little pathetic, hypocritic dork title at the end of our name says we know what we're talking about. And if somebody finds something that says something else, guess what? They're all wrong. And they can't be wrong. But just to give you an idea of what's going on. Alright, now we're going to briefly cover what's in front of the Sphinx, and that is the Sphinx and Valley temples. Now, in the Sphinx and Valley temples, which were obviously created, alright, basically the Sphinx sits in an enclosure. The enclosure was created because it was hollowed out, carved into blocks, and these blocks were taken and used to create the Sphinx and Valley temples. And some of these blocks are literally 30 feet long and weigh up to 250 tons. I want you to picture that in your mind. We're talking blocks that are literally as long, wide, and tall, and as heavy as a triple-decker bus. And they try to tell you that these guys just flipping these things around, like they were frickin', burgers on a griddle at McDonald's. And, I'm sorry, it's just amazing, because I love it, because I just watched this special, and I'm going to have a link up to it in the description below, where you have an Egyptologist sitting there going, if there were any signs of a previous advanced civilization, where are they? We wouldn't have missed such a scraps of little prophetic information talking about an antediluvian society so advanced. And the guy is so arrogant as hell, I just want to smack him. I bet he can make the good humor man want to smack him, okay? We're talking, it's just, I bet the Dalai Lama would want to smack this guy just by the demeanor he was giving off. The evidence is right there in front of them. Because the Sphinx and Valley temples are created from these huge blocks, stacked in ways you can't believe, but just like the pyramids behind them, there's not a single hieroglyph carved on the Sphinx and Valley temple blocks. Not one. Matter of fact, there are no hieroglyphs on the Sphinx, except for the dream stele, which was placed there by Thutmose IV. And that was allegedly 13 centuries after it was built. But it's right there in front of them. It seems like the older you go back in ancient history, the larger the blocks get. And this is not a single occurrence in Egypt. Because when you look at the Osirion, which is built over by the Temple of Seti I, and I believe that's in Abydos. This is yet another blunder by the Egyptologists, and I'm including it here to give you a frame of reference. The Osirion, the floor of it, and sits 50 feet below the Temple of Seti I, which sits right next to it. And once again, we're dealing with blocks roughly the same size as the ones used in the Sphinx and Valley Temple. And we're basically the same tonnage, up to 200 to 250 tons. And these things are stacked like Stonehenge. You know, literally pillars with blocks on top. It was like Godzilla was flipping these things around with a spatula. I'm sorry for the metaphor, but now I hope you're sitting down again. There are no hieroglyphs on the Osirion, not one. Yet because it's sitting next to the Temple of Seti I, they automatically have dated it from coming from that era. Keep this in mind when you look at the pictures. The Temple of Seti I, the ground of it is 50 feet below the floor. The Osirion's floor is 50 feet below the Temple of the Seti I floor. And it even looks like it was dug out of solid bedrock and later, filled in by time. Yet they claim, just because it's sitting next door to the Temple of Seti I, it was built in the time of Seti I. And it's just crazy. They make these wild assumptions, and I can't believe it. Alright, I've been ranting on long enough, but there's one thing I really have to cover before we depart on this vid. Something to give your mind a little wandering room. Something to really give you a little open ground here to play around with. Especially if you are one of the believers in an antediluvian society, such as Atlantis or whatnot. And I firmly believe, and a lot of others, scientists such as Hakim and whatnot, and Dr. Mailer gave me this idea, and I can't believe I've never thought of it before. What if Atlantis was a metaphor? Not an actual place, but a metaphor for what came before. And it's amazing when you look at all the hieroglyphs in Egypt that refer back to what they call Zep Tepi, the first time. And that is all over the place, Zep Tepi. And what are they referring to? Now, as you all know, there were studies by Dr. Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, which put forth the theory. As you'll notice, you have the pyramids there, and they're kind of, the third one of Menkaure is a little bit offset. Why they do that? Especially when the two larger pyramids are so well aligned. And of course, they discovered that these pyramids are aligned to the constellation of Sirius. Great, I just made a serious verbal blow. Sorry, folks. Back up, reverse it. It's just you get all these names in your head, you start screwing it up. I'm going off memory now. The three pyramids on the Giza Plateau are aligned to Orion's belt, which in the Egyptian religion was the area where Osiris dwelled, or Sirius. And they notice, okay, well, why are they upside down relative to what's in the sky? It turns out if you sit down and you run the clock back, and you can do this with a lot of astronomy programs now, that the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau line up to the Orion's belt, the three stars, as they were in 10,500 BC. That's amazing, and a little stretch, though, isn't it? But at the same time, on the sunrise of the vernal equinox in 10,500 BC, the constellation Leo is rising in the east, where the Sphinx stares due east, as if it is looking at its own representation in the sky. Could it be that the Giza Plateau, the Sphinx itself, are pointing back to Zep Tepi, the first time, and telling us that that first time was in 10,500 BC, before a great cataclysm wiped out their grand society? boggles the mind, doesn't it? But now here comes the closer. In the mid-40s, Edgar Cayce predicted that yes, there was an Atlantean civilization. It was very advanced, it was worldwide, and across the globe, in 4 different locations, if I remember this correctly, there would be halls of records left indicating all the knowledge, construction, science, and, of these, and culture of this lost civilization. And that one of these great halls of records would be found beneath the paws of the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. Bit of a stretch, isn't it? A little crazy. Until in the 90s, a seismographic study was done on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure. What was discovered was beneath the paws of the Sphinx, roughly 5 meters below the limestone bedrock, is a chamber that is rectangular. It's 9 meters by 12 meters and appears to be man-made. Send a chill up your spine, doesn't it? And just think, Cayce predicted this in the mid-1940s, and it would not be discovered till almost over 50 years after his death. He may have been right. Unfortunately, I do not hold any hope of anything being recovered from any Hall of Records, even though it's less than 15 feet under the paws of the Sphinx. Getting digging permission, even though Zahi Hawass is now somewhat a memory as far as things in Egypt go, even though he still runs things by invisible hands. Word reached me through a website, and like I said, I'm still shaky on the accuracy of this, or legitimacy, but I'm going to include it here because part of me believes it's true. That back in 2008, a bit of footage popped up on the internet, and I'm going to have to really look for it again to bring it up. That apparently somebody was digging near the Sphinx enclosure. Large semi-trucks were seen rolling out of that area in the middle of the night, and by the morning the dig was concluded, it was filled back in, and nobody was none the wiser as to what the hell went on there that night. Could it be there was an Atlantean Hall of Records and it has been cleaned out? And trust me, that's what I believe wholeheartedly, is even if they do find a chamber there, it's going to be empty now. Because we're not worthy to know the secrets of our ancestors. We're not worthy to know that maybe this wasn't mankind's first time on the merry-go-round, that we did have a great, beautiful, and peaceful and advanced civilization. We might have even gone to the stars. And the sad, depressing fact of the matter is, due to plague, ecological disaster, or some quirk of fate that we can't comprehend, we have lost an entire chapter in our history. A time that maybe we were something greater than we are now. And a tear still comes to my eye when I think about it, because it was even brought up by Richard C. Hoagland that maybe, just maybe, if there was something going on Cydonia on Mars, maybe we carved the face that looks back at us now. And that face, too, when I look at it, kind of has a sarcastic grin on it, like, I know something you don't know. Okay, kids, I've rambled on really longer than I thought. I'm hoping I even have enough pictures to cover this whole vid. And I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the Sphinx, the contradictions, and I want you to think for yourself when you look at articles from the past, and just imagine, maybe we are not the greatest, at this period in our history, and as John Anthony West put it, with our striped toothpaste and hydrogen bombs, maybe we're not the greatest and most advanced civilization that's ever walked on this planet in mankind's history. Maybe we're just a sad echo of what once was. Take it easy, YouTubers. This is Dr. Freedom. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Have a good night.